First of all, I want to thank Greg and Jocelyn for inviting us to be on the program today, and also for their foresight in having our talk following Brittany's. As was so noted by the gentleman in the front row here, it makes a lot of sense to focus our resources on some of these fields with higher phosphorus concentrations. And this project that we're starting at OSU demonstrates how we can get across some of the barriers to make that happen, and hopefully demonstrate how we'll get a bigger bang for our buck and be able to accelerate our improvements in water quality while also sustaining our ag yield. So thanks to Greg and Jocelyn. Thanks to y'all for coming today. I'm going to go ahead and present some of the rationale behind this project and talk a little bit about some of the initial plans that we made, and then I'm going to ask Nathan Stoltzfus to come up and talk about kind of where the rubber is hitting the road right now and some of the initial insights we have looking at some of our initial data. Randall challenged me to stand on the stage, so I'm going to go ahead and stand on the stage here. Let's see, so I'll go ahead and get going. I guess I need the clicker, though. I don't want to belabor Lake Erie. We've heard a lot about that. Tim Davis gave a great talk about harmful algal blooms this morning. The point I want to make is that myself and others in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at OSU, we're really striving to have balanced solutions for the Lake Erie issues. So we want to have solutions and ways forward that support residents and stakeholders and people whose livelihoods depend on Lake Erie, but we also want to be able to support residents and stakeholders and livelihoods in the upstream watersheds where agriculture is so important. So we're really looking for that sweet spot. And I think this project is a way that we can work with and through the agricultural community to realize those gains. So with that being an issue, trying to find that sweet spot between water quality and agricultural productivity over the last few years, we've really put a lot of focus, and this is based on some of Kevin and Brittany's work, on these elevated phosphorus fields. And this slide shows that we know these fields exist. This is some data from soil test analysis or soil test labs. And what this basically shows us is that looking across all the soil test results across Northwest Ohio, about 5% of the measurements, especially if we look at the Maumee watershed, are above 100 milligrams per kilogram. So these are about 2.5 times the agronomic levels that we look for. So we know these fields are out there. Going back to some of the last questions we had, the units I'm going to talk about today are all milligrams per kilogram. Malic 3, so try to keep that straight. I know there's some different units and methods there. Some of the counties, Fulton and Mercer, have a little higher concentrations. Some of the other counties have lower concentrations. I don't think that's so important. I think a lot of us in this room know it's really field by field where these fields are with elevated phosphorus levels in them. But we know that they're out there. This is based on Brittany's results. There's a greater amount of concern for this because what research has shown us, both within this area, and that's coming from Kevin's work, and then looking across other areas beyond Lake Erie, so looking at Pennsylvania, Chesapeake Bay, even going as far as the United Kingdom, we see that when we have higher soil test levels in the soil, there's more likely to be higher phosphorus runoff. Okay, so looking across this, what we know is that if we want to be able to accelerate water quality improvement, it makes a lot of sense to focus on these fields and see if we can make a difference here, just as we noted in the last presentation. So just to kind of review what we know, and this leads us in the rationale for this project that we're beginning to lead right now. We know these elevated phosphorus fields exist in Northwest Ohio, and we know that these fields are likely to disproportionately contribute phosphorus runoff. We also know that these contributions to runoff can last for decades. Okay, so some of these fields have pretty high levels of phosphorus in them. They're not just going to be disproportionately contributing phosphorus for 1 year, 5 years, but likely maybe 10 or 20 years. So it's important to get management to these fields and to maintain the management of these fields into the future. Putting all that together, we need to be able to target these fields, just as we noted in the last presentation. What we also know is there's some important barriers that prevent us from doing that. Okay, and that's what we're trying to jump past in this project. So those gaps in knowledge or those barriers are, how can we identify the location of these elevated phosphorus fields? Okay, there's not too many producers out there that want to raise their hand and say, hey, you know, we got the 200 milligrams per kilogram here. You know, bring the TV cameras this way. Not a whole lot of people want to do that. So how can the BMPs be located to these fields, and how can we test the presumably greater impact that they're going to have on these fields? And what we're mostly limited by here is by proprietary data and folks that are concerned about, you know, labeling themselves as having these type of fields. So the main way we're trying to work around this now through this project is by forming public-private partnerships and working through crop consultants or nutrient service providers. The crop consultants and nutrient service providers, they're very aware of what the soil test phosphorus levels are. So if we can work through them, they can reach out to their clients that have these fields, and they can say, hey, there's a group at Ohio State that has funds that wants to locate practices next to these fields to demonstrate how effective they'll be and how we can make progress towards improving water quality while maintaining yields. Once they identify some producers that want to work with us, we can start to work with them and see, hey, is this field make sense for us? Is this field something that we can monitor? Does this field have the right topography? Does it have enough space to put in an edge of field practice that'll make a difference there? So that's how we're moving forward, and that's how this project works. Looking at a bigger level, what we're trying to do here, traditionally we've had a kind of a public side and a private side. And on the public side, that's where a lot of the conservation takes place. NRCS provides a lot of dollars for cost shares. A lot of that flows through soil and water conservation districts, and they work with farmers to put those practices on fields. On the other side of the coin, if you will, or on the other side of this image, is a private side where nutrient service providers work with farmers and mostly focused on agronomic returns, being able to put the right amount of nutrients on those fields to get the yields that they want. And what we're trying to do by working through nutrient service providers is by trying to bring all that a little closer together so that a nutrient service provider who's aware of soil test phosphorus levels can maybe nudge that farmer, can nudge that producer a little bit and say, hey, you have an elevated phosphorus field here. We know that NRCS or SWCD has a cost share that can really help with that and kind of promote that conservation. So that's, on the bigger picture, that's something else we're trying to promote through this project. And lastly, by working through this whole group here, we hope to be able to find the right solution for the right fields and right location, things like that. So how do we go about forming the public-private partnership that we have to support this project? Well, first of all, we reached out to the Ohio Agribusiness Association, OABA. Myself and Jessica D'Ambrosia from Nature Conservancy reached out to them with this idea. They got behind it, and they reached out to some of the nutrient service providers in the 4R network. And you can see them listed here. They were interested, so we started to talk to them. And so right now we're working with these 4 nutrient service providers to try to move this project forward to identify field sites. And you can see what's interesting is we have a pretty good spread of different organizations here. So all the way from Nestor Ag, which is more of a family-run organization, and right below that's Nutrient Ag Solutions. So that, as you know, that's a nationwide establishment with different branches in Ohio. So by working with these different types of nutrient service providers, we hope to get a feel for how they can reach out to their clients and look at barriers that make it hard for them to do that, because this is one of the first times that they're actually doing this type of a project as well. Got a solid project team at OSU that's behind this. I do want to point out that we're also partnering with, on your right-hand side of the screen here, we have Kevin King. We just heard from Brittany talking about that research. So Kevin Kevin and his team have a great expertise in how to monitor these sites, and basically we're working with them to copy, I guess, or share their methods so we can have very good data to see what's running off these fields and also what's coming off of the management practices that we can put in, so we can see what goes in and what comes out and how effective they are. Greg Labarge is around here somewhere. He's on the team. And then Jessica D'Ambrosia from Nature Conservancy has also been really instrumental in getting this project moving forward. I think it's important to note we got other support from a lot of commodity groups, Farm Bureau, So there's a lot of support for this project moving forward. It's important to have the support of these groups as we try to identify field sites. So when a producer hears about the project, they also hear that it's supported by some trusted sources moving forward, and hopefully that'll help them want to work with us. The time frame and funding, I don't want to get into the details of this project. It is a 5-year project, so in short, during this first year, we hope to identify field sites. That's what we're spending a lot of time on now. Identify field sites, get the BMPs in place, get the monitoring systems in place, and then the last 4 years of the project is basically monitoring those sites to demonstrate, presumably, that we'll get a bigger bang for the buck by putting these practices next to these elevated phosphorus fields. With that, I'm going to call Nathan to the stage here. So Nathan's the project engineer, and I'm very fortunate to work with him, knowing him for quite a while. And Nathan's going to talk more about some of the initial insights and exactly how we're working with some of the NSPs to identify field sites.
Thanks, Jay. So as you can briefly see on this slide, we have it broken out into 3 objectives. I'm going to focus primarily on objective 1, as that's what we're spending our time on right now, but briefly touch on objectives 2 and 3 also. Right now we are well into the public-private partnership phase of this. We are collaborating a lot, very extensively, with the 4 nutrient service providers. So far we have collaborated with them to gain access to just all of their de-identified soil test results, and we are combing through that to pull out of there anything that is above our 100 milligrams per kilogram or 100 parts per million threshold. And from that list of data, we have selected 25 to 30 different fields that we think would be good candidates for our project. Once we had those 25 to 30 fields kind of picked out, the nutrient service providers have been kind of filling in some basic supplemental information on that field, such as kind of history, application of nutrients, what that field is like right now, all while being, at this point, still not attached to any particular specific location or farmer. The map that you can see on the right is just a basic spread of where all these different fields are, just by zip code. They don't represent any specific field, just general location, so you can get an idea of where we're talking. The step that we're in right now is that the nutrient service providers are approaching each of the producers with a short survey to gauge their interest, to gauge if the individual producer would be interested in possibly participating in this project. Right now we're getting those surveys back. As we're getting them back, we'll be proceeding with those who are interested, who would be potentially want to continue on to collaborate with us. We will be reviewing the field information, looking at that specific field, as Jay pointed out before, evaluate its potential for monitoring, to evaluate its potential for implementation of a best management practice. As this would not be possible, the project would not be possible without the support of both the farmers and the nutrient service providers. There is some funding in the project for some compensation. So what we're seeing so far is something that probably doesn't catch you all off guard, and that's that we're not talking about elevated fields, but rather we should be talking about elevated zones. These fields are large, anywhere from 5 to 30 zones in a field, depending on the size of the field, and it's mostly a small subset of those zones or of those grids that are elevated. The graph at the bottom clearly shows that it's primarily the block between 0 and 25% of the zones in a field that are above that 100 milligrams per kilogram threshold. As you move towards the right of that graph up to 75%, very few fields have 75% of the zones that are elevated. All the way on the right-hand side, you see a high bar at 100%. Now, the data that we were looking at doesn't tell us anything about these fields, but by talking with the nutrient service providers, we know that those are primarily garden sites, fields, quote unquote, with one zone that is very high. So we're not looking at any garden sites for this project. This graph shows a little differently the kind of the density of the soil test reading results. We can see that the dotted line up there is the point at which a reading is over the 100 parts per million threshold. The data that we looked at showed 6% of total readings corresponded to that greater than 100 milligrams per kilogram. The green line there is the agronomic level, and the blue line is the threshold that we have for this project at 100 parts per million. So again, only 6% of the zones that we saw were above that soil test phosphorus level of 100 parts per million, and that roughly corresponded to about 15% of the fields that we were looking at. These that we see here are two examples of fields that we've seen. These fields could be anywhere within the Western Lake Erie Basin. The one on the left is 19 acres, and the one on the right is 15. The one on the left is what we're used to seeing, what most of the fields look like, and that is there are multiple zones in that field, but only one, and the one on the left, the yellow in the middle, is the high area of that field. The one on the right is a field that we don't see as often, and that is where all of the zones in that field are greater than 100 parts per million. In this case, it ranged anywhere from about 170 to 220. So the fields that are constantly elevated are out there, but we see very few of them, as the graph on the previous slide showed. Most of them are very similar to the field on the left. So as we're going through these fields, we'll be looking at various characteristics that will determine whether or not they are suitable to be monitored. We'll be looking at slope, we'll be looking at drainage patterns, how tile is laid out, and what surrounds this field to see if, for this project, it could be monitored feasibly. As we're working on each of these fields, we begin a dialogue with the farmer to see what they would be interested in, what sort of best management practice would fit into their production scheme, and that they would be comfortable with being installed or implemented in that particular field. Some of the edge of field practices that we anticipate implementing and studying are phosphorus filters, constructed wetlands, hopefully some drainage water management systems. There is potential for in-field management changes also, conservation crop rotations, cover crops, and no-till. So as we're discussing, as we're dialoguing with each of the farmers, we'll see what best fits into their production scheme. What would they be comfortable with? But we anticipate that that it will be in this suite of best management practices, and these are all pulled from the Ag BMP Handbook that Greg and lots of others helped put together. So we don't really intend to employ novel schemes in this. We are just aimed at evaluating the effectiveness of what is already recommended in the BMP Handbook and evaluate how effective these best management practices are in the setting of an elevated phosphorus field. The monitoring scheme that we're going to be using is going to look very similar, because it's basically a replication of what Kevin and his group and all that have implemented so successfully. Their edge of field monitoring network is very extensive, and they've done really amazing work at getting great data off of those sites. And so we don't plan to try anything too novel. We're going to be mimicking what they have done to collect and sample both tile runoff and surface runoff from each of the sites. So that all is under the umbrella of Objective 1. Objective 1 is implementing best management practices and evaluating the effectiveness. Objective 2 that I'll briefly touch on here gets more into the socioeconomic analyses, where we will be conducting surveys and focus groups both with producers and nutrient service providers. We really want to get to the heart and understand the history of these elevated phosphorus fields, see if there's a common thread that kind of weaves through and ties everything together. Just want to evaluate what motives are and how best to incentivize and to get people who have these elevated phosphorus fields to consider a best management practice. And then the third of Objective 2 that I'm pretty excited about is exploring how to expand guidance for nutrient service providers to include conservation practices in their conversations with the farmers. So traditionally, historically, nutrient service providers, crop consultants, have been in the realm of fertilizer recommendations, how much of what fertilizer to put on. We want to at least begin the conversation to begin to explore what it would look like for the nutrient service providers to step into the realm of some conservation practices. These nutrient service providers, as you all know, are the ones that have a long-term relationship with each of the farmers. They know what is happening on each of the fields, and we want to capitalize on that knowledge and on that relationship and explore what it would look like to empower them to begin to nudge a farmer into the direction of a conservation practice on an elevated field where it makes sense. So that is where we hope that they can just become more familiar with edge of field best management practices, surface water best management practices, and start to head that direction. Objective 3 is kind of a synthesis of 1 and 2, taking what we've learned by the actual implementation and the monitoring and what we have learned from the socioeconomic analyses and these surveys and focus groups and putting it together as a message for outreach. So we have a number of things that we'll be doing, such as presenting here at CTC throughout the years. We'll be both participating in and initiating different field days. We're partnering with the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Council, and we'll have a web presence as a part of their website also. So we really hope to get what we're learning into the hands of people who can use the information and really start to make a difference. So Objective 3 will be ongoing throughout the life of the project, but really ramp up towards the end when we have some meaningful results to show. So with that, I want to thank you and for your time and attention, and just I hope that we have been able to convey the vision of what we hope to accomplish with this project, why we feel it's so important, both with Objective 1 in the monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of best management practices, in the understanding the rationale with the survey groups and focus groups, and then with getting the word out into everybody to hopefully improve water quality, maintain production, and hopefully improve Lake Erie over these years. So.